May 27, 1942. A hospital room in Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral William Halsey, commander of Task Force 16, lay bedridden with a severe case of shingles. His skin was covered in painful lesions. He could barely move. In 48 hours, the United States Navy would face the most important naval battle in its history, and its most aggressive commander was out of the fight. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood at Halsey's bedside. They both knew what was coming. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval communications. The enemy was bringing 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and dozens of support ships to invade Midway Island. If the Japanese succeeded, Hawaii would be next. The entire Pacific would be lost. Nimitz needed a replacement for Halsey immediately. But who? Most of the senior admirals with carrier experience were already deployed or unsuitable for the task. Time was running out. Halsey looked at Nimitz and said one name: Raymond Spruance. Nimitz was surprised. Spruance commanded the cruiser escorts for Task Force 16. He was a surface warfare officer, not an aviator. He had never commanded carriers in combat. The Japanese were bringing their best carrier admirals, men who had devastated Pearl Harbor and conquered half the Pacific. And Halsey wanted to send a cruiser commander against them? But Halsey was insistent. Spruance was solid, he said. He had the temperament. He understood naval tactics better than anyone Halsey knew. He wouldn't panic under pressure. Nimitz trusted Halsey's judgment. Within hours, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance received orders he never expected. He would command Task Force 16, comprising the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, in the most critical naval engagement of the war. The Japanese had no idea what was about to hit them. June 3, 1942. The Japanese carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, steamed toward Midway. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo commanded 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They carried 248 aircraft and the best naval aviators in the world. The Japanese had been unstoppable. In 6 months, they had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and countless Pacific islands. Their carrier force had never been defeated. Nagamo's orders were straightforward. Bomb Midway's defenses, soften the island for invasion, then wait for the American carriers to arrive from Pearl Harbor. When they showed up, destroy them. The Japanese expected the Americans would take at least a week to respond. They were wrong. The Americans were already there. 3 carrier task forces positioned northeast of Midway. Task Force 16 under Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with Yorktown. Fletcher was the senior officer, so he had overall tactical command. But he gave Spruance significant operational freedom. That decision would change everything. American cryptanalysts had not only broken the Japanese naval code, they knew exactly where the enemy would strike and when. It was the intelligence coup of the war. For the first time, the Americans would ambush the Japanese, not the other way around. Aboard Enterprise, Spruance studied the tactical situation. The Japanese carriers were approximately 200 miles southwest. They would launch their strike on Midway at dawn. That meant their flight decks would be crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. If American dive bombers could hit them during that vulnerable window, they could cripple the entire Japanese carrier force. But there was a problem. To reach the Japanese fleet, American aircraft would have to launch at maximum range. Many planes wouldn't have enough fuel to return. Pilots would have to ditch in the ocean. It was a gamble. Launch too early and the planes might not find the target. Launch too late and the Japanese carriers would spot the American fleet first. Spruance made his decision. They would launch everything at 0700 hours. June 4, 1942. Dawn broke over the Pacific. Japanese bombers and fighters roared off the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, heading for Midway. The Americans on the island had already detected them on radar. Every aircraft at Midway scrambled to meet the attack. Marine pilots in obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats flew straight into a formation of Japanese Zeros. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by combat veterans. The Marines were outmatched 4-1. They fought anyway. More than half of them were shot down. But they bloodied the Japanese attack and gave Midway's defenders precious minutes to prepare. When the Japanese bombers arrived over Midway, they found the island's aircraft already airborne. Hangars and fuel tanks burned, but the runways remained operational. The Japanese strike leader radioed back to Nagamo. Midway needed a second attack. At that moment, a Japanese reconnaissance plane radioed a shocking message. American ship sighted. Nagamo was stunned. The Americans weren't supposed to be here. Not yet. How could they know? But reconnaissance couldn't confirm if the American force included carriers. Nagamo faced an agonizing decision. His aircraft were being refueled and rearmed below decks. Half were still configured with land attack bombs for the second strike on Midway. If American carriers were out there, he needed to switch his aircraft to ship-killing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The changeover would take time, precious time. Japanese deck crews worked frantically, removing land attack ordnance and hauling up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from the magazines. Aircraft set on the hangar decks, fuel lines connected, bombs stacked nearby. It was the worst possible moment to be caught. American torpedo bombers arrived first. 15 Douglas TBD Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 came in low and slow. The Japanese Zeros fell on them like wolves. One by one, the American planes were shot down. Out of 15 aircraft, 14 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit. Then came Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise. 10 more Devastators attacked. 8 were shot down. Again, no hits. Finally, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. 12 Devastators pressed their attack. 10 were shot down. The slaughter was horrific. Out of 41 American torpedo bombers, only 6 survived. Not one scored a hit. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had massacred them. But the torpedo bombers had done something critical. They had pulled every Japanese Zero down to wave top level, chasing the slow-moving Devastators. The sky above the Japanese carriers was empty. At 10:20 hours, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet and were running low on fuel. McCluskey was about to turn back when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing northeast at high speed. The destroyer had been depth charging the American submarine Nautilus and was now hurrying to rejoin the carrier force. McCluskey made a split-second decision. Follow that destroyer. He banked his dive bombers southwest. Minutes later, the Japanese carriers appeared below. 4 of them. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their flight decks were crammed with aircraft. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes sat exposed. The carriers were in the middle of launching their strike against the American fleet. It was the perfect moment. McCluskey split his force. Half would hit Kaga, half would hit Akagi. At the exact same moment, 17 Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived over the Japanese fleet. They targeted Soryu. The Japanese never saw them coming. The Zeros were still at sea level, finishing off the last torpedo bombers. No Japanese fighters were in position to intercept. Within 5 minutes, American dive bombers transformed the Pacific War. Enterprise bombers screamed down on Kaga. 3 bombs struck the carrier. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, where fueled and armed aircraft were packed together. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Fire spread instantly. More Enterprise bombers hit Akagi, Nagamo's flagship. 2 bombs smashed through the flight deck. One detonated among aircraft waiting to launch. Another penetrated to the hangar deck, where torpedoes and bombs were stacked during the frantic rearming. The explosion was catastrophic. Yorktown's dive bombers struck Soryu with 3 bombs. The carrier erupted in flames. All 3 carriers were burning out of control. Fuel fires spread across the flight decks. Magazine explosions tore holes in the ship's hulls. Japanese damage control teams couldn't contain the inferno. In less than 5 minutes, the most powerful carrier-striking force in the world had been destroyed. Japan had lost 3 of its 4 fleet carriers. But Hiryu survived. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commander of Hiryu's battle group, immediately launched a counterstrike. Every available aircraft on Hiryu was armed and sent after the American carriers. Just before noon, 18 Japanese dive bombers found Yorktown. American fighters shot down more than half, but 4 bombers got through. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, tearing open the flight deck and starting massive fires. The carrier lost power and began listing. Fletcher transferred his flag to a cruiser and turned tactical command over to Spruance. Now everything depended on the man who had never commanded carriers in combat before. Spruance studied the tactical picture. Hiryu was still operational. Japanese intelligence reports suggested more enemy carriers might be in the area. Spruance had 2 intact carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, but he didn't know what else the Japanese had waiting. This was the moment that would define Spruance's command. An aggressive admiral like Halsey might have charged west immediately, chasing the Japanese fleet for a decisive engagement. Spruance didn't. He focused on his primary objective. Protect Midway. Destroy the enemy carriers. Don't risk the American fleet unnecessarily. Late afternoon, a scout plane from Yorktown located Hiryu. Spruance immediately launched a strike. 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, augmented by orphaned aircraft from Yorktown, attacked at 1700 hours. 4 bombs hit Hiryu. The carrier exploded into flames just like her sister ships. Japan's last operational carrier at Midway was finished. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. The Japanese Navy had just lost perhaps its finest carrier officer. Now Spruance faced the most critical decision of the battle. It was evening. The Japanese surface fleet was somewhere to the west. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Admiral Yamamoto's main body included the massive battleship Yamato, the largest warship in the world. Spruance had intelligence reports suggesting more Japanese forces in the area. His carriers had been fighting all day. Pilots were exhausted. Night was falling. Many officers urged Spruance to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet. Finish them off. Complete the victory. This was the chance to destroy the Japanese Navy entirely, but Spruance refused. The Japanese excelled at night surface combat. Their crews trained extensively for night engagements. American forces did not. If Spruance pushed west into the darkness, he could sail straight into a trap. Japanese battleships and cruisers could savage his carriers at close range before dawn. Moreover, Spruance's primary mission was to defend Midway, not chase the enemy fleet into unknown waters. He had already accomplished his objective. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. The invasion force turned back. Why risk everything on a night pursuit? Spruance ordered Task Force 16 to turn east, away from the enemy. He would stay within range of Midway's land-based aircraft for protection. He would maintain his defensive posture. Let the Japanese come to him if they wanted another fight. Some officers were baffled. Others were furious. They had the Japanese on the run. Why stop now? But Spruance understood something his critics did not. He had already won. History would prove Spruance's caution was genius. If he had pursued the Japanese fleet that night, he would have sailed directly toward Yamamoto's battleships and cruisers, forces vastly superior in surface combat. The American carriers, exhausted and low on aircraft, could have been destroyed in a night engagement. Instead, Spruance preserved his fleet and secured the victory. June 5th, the Japanese fleet retreated westward. On the American side, Yorktown was still afloat, badly damaged but salvageable. Salvage crews worked to save the carrier. The three Japanese carriers that had been struck the previous day, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, finally sank. Hiryu followed them to the bottom in the early morning. Spruance sent search planes west, looking for remnants of the Japanese fleet. Late in the afternoon, American dive bombers found Japanese heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma. Both ships had collided during evasive maneuvers the night before and were limping away. Spruance launched strikes on June 6th. The dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet attacked repeatedly. Mikuma was pounded into a blazing wreck and sank. Mogami was severely damaged but escaped. As American aircraft harassed the retreating Japanese cruisers, tragedy struck Yorktown. Japanese submarine I-168 slipped through the destroyer screen. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown. A third hit the destroyer Hammond, which broke in half and sank immediately. Yorktown capsized and sank on June 7th. She was the only American carrier lost at Midway. The battle was over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Also lost was the heavy cruiser Mikuma and 3,000 men, including many of Japan's best-trained naval aviators. Pilots took years to train and were nearly impossible to replace. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. It was one of the most lopsided naval victories in history. The battle shattered Japanese carrier aviation. Japan's industrial base could not replace the lost carriers quickly. More importantly, they could never replace the lost aircrews. The highly trained pilots and maintainers who had conquered half the Pacific were gone. Within 6 months of Midway, Japan would be on the defensive. The Americans would begin their island-hopping campaign in the Solomon Islands. The carriers that would win the Pacific War, the new Essex-class fleet carriers, began arriving at the end of 1942. Midway bought the United States the time it needed. But none of this would have happened without Raymond Spruance's decisions on June 4th and 5th. Historians and naval officers have analyzed Spruance's performance at Midway for decades. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official U.S. Navy historian, called it superb. Morison wrote that Spruance emerged from the battle as one of the greatest fighting and thinking admirals in American naval history. He praised Spruance's ability to be bold and aggressive when the situation demanded offensive action, yet cautious when pushing his luck might have lost the fruits of victory. Admiral Nimitz praised Spruance immediately after the battle and awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal. His citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious service during the Midway engagement which resulted in the defeat of and heavy losses to the enemy fleet, his seamanship, endurance, and tenacity in handling his task force were of the highest quality." But Spruance's critics argued he had been too cautious. They said he should have pursued the Japanese fleet on the night of June 4th. They claimed he missed an opportunity to annihilate the entire Japanese Navy in one battle. What if he had caught Yamamoto's battleships? What if he had sunk the rest of the Japanese surface fleet? The war might have ended years earlier. These criticisms intensified after the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when Spruance again prioritized protecting the amphibious landings over chasing the Japanese fleet. The debate continues today. Should Spruance have been more aggressive? Did his caution cost the Americans a chance at total victory? But these criticisms miss the fundamental point. Spruance's mission at Midway was not to chase the Japanese fleet into the darkness. His mission was to defend Midway and destroy the enemy carriers threatening it. He accomplished both objectives decisively while preserving American naval power for future operations. Consider what would have happened if Spruance had pursued the Japanese on the night of June 4th. He would have led 2 exhausted carrier groups, low on aircraft and fuel, into a night engagement with Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers specifically trained for close-range surface combat. The Japanese had 8 battleships in the area. The Americans had none. Japanese cruisers and destroyers carried the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the most lethal torpedo in the war. American carriers had no defense against surface ships at night. If Spruance had pushed west, he could have lost Enterprise and Hornet. The Japanese would have traded 4 carriers for all 6 American fleet carriers in the Pacific. Japan would have regained carrier superiority. The invasion of Midway might have succeeded. The entire strategic situation in the Pacific would have reversed. Spruance understood this. He had spent 3 tours at the Naval War College. He knew naval doctrine better than almost anyone in the Navy. He knew the Japanese preferred one decisive battle where they could use their superior night fighting skills. He refused to give them that chance. What made Spruance's victory at Midway even more remarkable was that he achieved it with virtually no carrier command experience. He was a cruiser and destroyer officer. He had never led carriers in combat before Midway. Yet he outfought and outhawed some of Japan's most experienced carrier admirals. How? Spruance approached the battle with clarity about his objectives. Defend Midway. Destroy enemy carriers. Preserve the American fleet. Every decision he made served these goals. When he launched his aircraft at maximum range on the morning of June 4th, it was because catching the Japanese carriers with their decks full was worth the risk of losing aircraft to fuel exhaustion. When he turned east on the night of June 4th, instead of pursuing west, it was because preserving his carriers was more important than chasing a retreating enemy into the darkness. Spruance's temperament was also critical. He was known as the quiet admiral. He didn't seek glory. He didn't make impulsive decisions. Subordinates described him as calm even in moments of crisis. Other officers nicknamed him Electric Brain for his ability to think clearly under pressure. That calmness proved invaluable at Midway. When Japanese bombers crippled Yorktown and Fletcher transferred command to Spruance, he didn't panic. He assessed the situation and made the decision to strike Hiryu immediately. When officers urged him to pursue the Japanese fleet that night, he considered the risks and refused. His decision-making was methodical, careful, and ultimately correct. After Midway, Spruance became one of the most important American commanders in the Pacific. He served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Nemitz, then took command of the Central Pacific Force, which became the 5th Fleet in April 1944. From 1943 to 1945, Spruance directed the campaigns that captured the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, while supporting the invasion of Saipan, Spruance's carriers destroyed more than 600 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. Yet even at the Philippine Sea, Spruance faced criticism for not being aggressive enough. His carriers had shattered the Japanese carrier force, but some officers argued he should have pursued more aggressively and destroyed all the enemy carriers. Spruance refused. His primary mission was protecting the troops landing at Saipan. He would not leave them exposed by chasing the Japanese fleet beyond range. The debate between Spruance's cautious approach and Halsey's aggressive style defined American carrier operations in the Pacific. When Halsey returned to command in October 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, his aggressive pursuit of Japanese carriers nearly exposed American landing forces to destruction. Only desperate heroism by escort carriers and destroyers at the Battle off Samar prevented catastrophe. Both Spruance and Halsey were brilliant commanders, but their approaches differed fundamentally. Halsey sought decisive fleet engagements. Spruance prioritized mission accomplishment and force preservation. Historians have debated for 80 years which approach was correct. The answer is both. Sometimes aggressiveness wins battles. Sometimes caution preserves them. But at Midway, On June 4th, 1942, Raymond Spruance made the right decisions. He launched his strike at the perfect moment, catching the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. He destroyed 4 enemy carriers while losing only one of his own. He refused to pursue the Japanese fleet into a night engagement that could have reversed the entire battle. He accomplished his mission completely. The turning point of the Pacific War came not from the admiral everyone expected, but from the cruiser commander nobody saw coming. The quiet admiral who thought before he acted. The officer who understood that sometimes the boldest move is knowing when to stop. Raymond Spruance took command of Task Force 16 less than 72 hours before the most important naval battle of World War II. He had never commanded carriers in combat. He faced the Japanese Navy at the height of its power. And he won. That victory changed everything. The Japanese never recovered. The Americans never looked back. And it all happened because one admiral, thrust into command at the last moment, made the right decisions when it mattered most.